And now back to the regularly scheduled discussion about the silly magic gunsword anime I love. This is part 2. If you missed part 1, you should consider watching it. It's just like part 2, only it's 1. So, quick little bit of housekeeping before we begin. One of my biggest flaws as an essay writer is a tendency to overestimate the extent to which people will get what I mean, even when I'm trying to be careful with my wording so that I don't run into that problem. When I took a pot shot at the shitbirds who present homophobic arguments as if they're genuine flaws with the storytelling in the last video, most of you seemed to catch my drift, but there was a subsect of you who seemed to think that I was saying that if you dislike the Blake and Yang subplot at all, you're probably homophobic. This was not my intention, but looking at my exact wording, I can see how you might think I implied that, so my apologies for the confusion. That is not what I was saying. Anyways, let's get cracking.
I remember thinking, I'm glad that girl's not dead.
I am so torn about Penny being alive, mainly because it's just so good to see her again. I didn't really realize how much of a Polendina fanboy I still was until suddenly she was on my screen again and I was crying. And she is so consistently charming and hilarious this volume. But I have a very long and complicated relationship with the idea of characters coming back from the dead. Normally, my issue with fake-out deaths is that I never actually bought that the character was dead in the first place, which pulls me right out of the narrative. But this? I bought this, which is why it feels a little cheap that the only explanation for her resurrection is, yeah, she died in the arena, so we just kind of brought her back and fixed her. Especially because, even though her death was the moment her robotic nature was exposed to the world, it wasn't met with confusion and hope so much as horrible sadness. In a way, I really appreciated how all of the characters never even brought up the idea that she could be fixed, because real people cannot be fixed when they die. Even in death, they treat her the way she wanted to be treated, like a real girl. But now, she has been fixed. So that's kind of a strange dynamic. But another thing that blunts the emotional impact of her return is that the entire world doesn't seem to care as much as we, the audience, do. Penny's death was a turning point for this entire show. It incited the largest grim attack we'd seen so far, was used as a weapon to annihilate trust in public leaders, broke RWBY, once again only for a few minutes before she was kicking ass again, and led into what is still the most insane, suspenseful, and utterly devastating conclusion that this show has ever delivered. But, perhaps most importantly, the horrific tragedy set the tone going forward. Her resurrection does comparatively little for the narrative, at least until long after the reveal, and it's, well, unceremonious at best. RWBY isn't the only character who reacts minimally. We don't even find out what the initial reaction to her sudden return was from the general public, and everyone else is just like, oh, how wholesome. Anyways, and then they go casually eat cake in the place where she got accidentally murdered by an innocent student, who is also dead, by the way. How the fuck does Jean feel about being back here? And also, how does he feel about RWBY getting her friend back and Pyrrha still being dead? Where are all the emotions? This is the other, perhaps harder to fix problem with fake-out deaths, specifically with ones where the character doesn't come back for a while. A character death tends to be a fairly major narrative event. If you're doing it right, the ones who cared about them should have to cope with the inevitable flood of horrible anger and sadness that comes with losing a loved one. It'll probably be a part of their arc. They'll learn to live again, they'll grow past it, they'll move on. Because, without getting too philosophical about it, we look to stories to be inspired by characters we identify with, and that is exactly what real people have to go through too. But real people don't get to suddenly see their dead friend again. In the vast majority of circumstances, when someone is gone, they're gone, and you have to learn to live with that. Characters who witness loved ones coming back from the dead may have learned, grown, and moved on, but suddenly, it turns out, they never had to. Suddenly, all of that heartbreak, sorrow, tragedy, angst, and growth, usually painted as the way to heal, is shown to have been unnecessary from the start. If only they'd held on to that denialistic hope at the very beginning, they could have been spared a lot of pain. It's a narrative issue that is really hard to spin in a way that everyone will appreciate and that doesn't compromise the spirit of your story. This is probably why I've only ever seen one, I repeat, one fake-out death that I actually liked. Penny is not it. Don't get me wrong, despite the accompanying thematic mayhem, I definitely prefer her alive rather than dead, and I might be willing to forgive the returning to life conundrum if they did something really powerful with Penny this volume to make up for it. But as hard as they may have tried, Penny's arc is kind of a mess. The first place we really get to dig into something resembling an emotional arc for Penny is during this conversation, where she says she wishes she could balance her wants and needs, which is a fairly similar problem to Winter's later talk of personal feelings conflicting with loyalty and duty. She also says that Ironwood told her she doesn't have time for friends, but that's kind of it. Very minimal, definitely not the kind of conversation that these two needed to have. Then, all of a sudden, she gets framed for this world's equivalent of a mass shooting. Okay, that's fucked, but I don't really see what that has to do with what was being set up previously, and I guess we're moving on. In the next episode, we learn that there are people calling for her to be shut down. This is something I actually really appreciate, because back in Volume 3, part of the tragedy wasn't just that she died, but also that the whole world learned her secret. And here we see the consequences of that. These people don't know Penny the way we do. They think of her like just another Atlas robot, but shinier and more powerful. So they don't treat her like a real person, they treat her like a malfunctioning machine that needs to be turned off. However, all we get from Penny is that she is sad, and later Pietro says that she's scared and confused. Okay, that makes sense. You're not gonna go any deeper than that? No? Okay. So, the dramatic consequences of this whole framing incident for Penny and her arc is that she's sad for a little bit, but eventually her name gets cleared, she saves some people in Mantle, they cheer for her, and she feels better. Even though there's no reason why these people would have changed their minds. She was the protector of Mantle before, now she is again, and she hasn't exactly proven her humanity to them by doing her job. If she were to do something wrong, they would probably go right back to clamoring for her to be shut down or removed from duty, like a buggy AI in a video game instead of a person. And the show would probably continue to not explore how Penny feels about that and the philosophy of her nature as a Frankenstein-esque constructed human. Even so, that's the end of the framing incident, and the rest of Penny's arc is centered around Winter and emotions. Right off the bat, she is the foil to Winter's uptight emotional self-policing, and remains that way in the climax, the angel on her shoulder, forcing her to reconsider what she's doing. However, Winter takes on the role of the older and wiser, Penny as the young and naive, and Winter teaches that grappling with personal feelings is what makes you human. I think this is supposed to lead to this choice, saving Winter instead of stopping Cinder from getting to Freya. Then, later, Penny becomes the Winter Maiden. Huh. It's clear to me that this is supposed to be a moment of apotheosis for her, especially with the fairy tale implications of Penny being Pinocchio and Freya being the Blue Fairy. This isn't just supposed to be a moment of physical empowerment, but also emotional empowerment. She is worthy in Freya's eyes to receive the power. She's become a real girl. And then, without even putting any real emphasis on the decision, like it's a given and not a major thing, Penny betrays Ironwood, escapes with Team RWBY, and becomes a fugitive. Other than that whiplash-inducing conclusion, it took me a while to figure out exactly what it was that wasn't sitting well with me about this arc. But then, one day, while I was sitting on my ass doing absolutely nothing and staring blankly at the wall, like I always do, it struck like lightning. Penny is already a real girl. That was the end of her brief arc in Volume 2, validation from RWBY that she has a heart and soul even though she's made of metal. She makes Penny feel better about her secret, and Penny seems to take it to heart. How sweet. But the thing is, RWBY's not just saying that, she's right. There's nothing about Penny besides having a mechanical body that would indicate she's anything less than fully human. She has emotions, she has agency, she has independent thoughts, she has a sense of kindness, presumably stemming from a sense of morality, she can feel love, and she passes the Turing test with flying colors every time. Well, maybe not flying colors, but you get the idea. The only major things that made the plot twist that she's a robot so predictable back in Volume 2 is an off-kilter personality and a lack of total social awareness, which are both tropey ways to represent a robot with capacity for thought rivaling a real human's. But if the only difference between a human and a robot is being extremely socially inept and awkward, then someone call the Brotherhood of Steel, because a synth has made it all the way to California and it's narrating a RWBY video essay right now. Penny didn't need to become a real girl, she was a good candidate for the Winter Maiden power from the very beginning. I have no doubt that the choice she made to save Winter is a choice she would have made with just as little hesitation if it were still Penny in Volume 1. Her little arc at the end here is framed as if she's coming to a grand realization, but in reality it's more like she's making a decision, and it's the only decision she would have made. I cannot picture a reality in which any version of Penny subscribes to the Winter Schnee school of disregarding emotions to do what must be done. So she really just doubles down on a way of thinking that she already possesses, which is fine, I guess, but it's kind of minimal, especially considering that this leads into her getting the power of the Winter Maiden, which is a choice she makes not as a part of her emotional arc, but out of necessity. She hesitates, but only because she's humble, and because her getting the power wasn't originally the plan. Again, that's fine, but I do think Penny is a good character and I really like her, but there's something missing here. And I think the best way to explain why I didn't like this is to give an alternative. So, just like with the exposition video, please keep in mind that I don't claim to be an expert writer or even a good writer, and it's extremely easy to make changes sound good when you're sitting on a mountain of hindsight and don't have to actually write the damn thing. That being said, looking at the place where Penny ends up at the end of the volume, I do think I would have preferred a narrative where Penny actually had to work past some kind of character flaw or insecurity to get to a place where she can choose to take the Winter Maiden power and betray Ironwood. Especially considering that Freya seems to have some kind of deteriorating memory in her old age, and Freya is the one who plants the idea that Penny should take the power. What if Penny didn't have all of her memories? What if she came back not knowing who RWBY even is, and with a fundamentally changed personality? She could be a little bit more like Winter, colder, more ruthless and unconcerned with emotions, more robotic, someone who is, in Ironwood's eyes, easier to control, yada yada puppet strings, yada yada. But she wouldn't have lost the spark of humanity within her. The main emotional insecurity making her feel inadequate or incomplete could be that gap in her memory, her lack of first-hand knowledge about who she used to be and what happened to her, which is ultimately why she would tolerate RWBY's efforts to befriend her, knowing that RWBY knew the previous Penny. And yes, this means RWBY would have to actually make an effort with her. Penny would see befriending RWBY as giving in to weakness at first, but gradually, through RWBY's convincing and through her own realizations, she'd start to question the perspective of Ironwood, of Winter, of the Aesops, more and more, until eventually, everything is going to shit, and she's starting to think she knows better than her orders, but hesitates, and then it's time to save Winter. Suddenly, saving Winter over the Maiden isn't a given, it's a moment of triumph, of Penny starting to reclaim some of her old self and rejecting the idea of being Ironwood's puppet, especially if you have an example of her ruthlessly not saving someone to prioritize her orders earlier in the volume. That way, she would earn the power of the Winter Maiden. The final thing stopping her from taking Freya's power, other than just general uncertainty, would be her own personal opinion that she wouldn't be a worthy vessel, that due to her robotic nature and missing memories, she is somehow incomplete. And Freya, someone with a body and a mind that, while fully human, have decayed, someone who also struggles with memory, could reassure her that it isn't about what you remember or what you're made of, but about who you are and what you do now. She could take the power believing in herself for the first time in the volume, earn her redemption, become a real girl again rather than just starting there and thinking about emotions for a bit, and then taking the power due to a ticking clock in the form of a screaming grim woman. You could even reward that transformation by having her remember something. Not everything, but one little thing, a cute memory with RWBY right when she gets the power, to suggest that it really is her, that she really is fully human again. Or maybe that she was a real girl all along. I feel like if this were the case, the plot would be significantly different, but so many moments would hit way harder. The moment where Winter says you wouldn't understand would hurt her on a couple different levels, and the moment where Penny chooses to go with RWBY and her friends to save Mantle instead of following Ironwood's orders would be powerful and earned rather than glossed over like it means nothing. When Ozpin is monologuing about fear and says, "Will you forgive that person?" while the camera focuses on RWBY and Weiss comforting Penny, it would have so much more weight if Penny had actually done something wrong on her path to Winter Maidenhood. And that's not even mentioning the fact that if Pietro was unhappy with Ironwood's mandate that he program her personality to be colder and easier to control, it would give him a reason to betray Ironwood other than just because. And hey, if that personality changed on its own, it would kind of be the ultimate validation of Penny being a real girl, that she can go beyond a preset and make her own decisions. And RWBY's unhappiness with Ironwood's mandate would give her an even stronger reason to distrust him right out the gate, okay, I got a little carried away, but do you see what I mean? My idea is just an idea, and there's no guarantee it would be anything resembling a good character arc if it were actually fleshed out. But I think it highlights the ways in which what Penny actually has going on in this volume is kind of lacking. Not to say that they didn't have any neat ideas, and if you liked Penny and her arc, don't let my nitpicking stop you, but in my opinion, not unlike Yang's arc in Volume 5, the ideas here don't really come together in enough of a coherent fashion to lead to what could have been a really good ending if they had. It feels like Penny wasn't really given the space she needed to flourish, having to share with the other returning characters and this whole slew of new characters. Matter of fact, let's talk about the Aesops, shall we? I did not dislike them, and I felt that they actually did a fairly good job of making them immediately unique and likable on a surface level. Even wearing the same uniform and always showing up together, each of them is extremely distinct, both in terms of design and in terms of personality. Marrow is my personal favorite. I never got tired of the rookie trying to be a hard ass to the new guys, but he's actually glad they're there dynamic. But, as we all know, this volume ends with one of them being murdered and the others having a showdown with Team RWBY, and I didn't really care. Normally, the narrative device of good guys fighting good guys over a disagreement about what good means can be pretty heart-wrenching, or at least intense. I remember freaking out in the theater when I was younger and it looked like Poe and Tigress were gonna fight. But here, it isn't really all that heartbreaking or painful. In fact, it feels cathartic to see them win against the dudes who were showing off and training them earlier. The show knows it, war is hardly the song to play over a somber affair, and that's a perfectly adequate approach. At least these four being mini-bosses with just a touch of history and personality is fine. But I can't help but wonder how this would have gone down if the Aesops had been given a little bit more breathing room, if they'd been developed and their relationships with our protagonists expanded upon just a bit more. The one place where I'd actually call this a flaw is with Clover. We're gonna talk about his death now, so be aware.
Alchemy, the science of understanding, deconstructing, and reconstructing matter. However, it is not an all-powerful art. It is impossible to create something out of nothing. If one wishes to obtain something, something of equal value must be given.
I warned you. In this case, I think Murder of Birds making the comparison to Squad Levi is very accurate. Attack on Titan has a tendency to introduce you to characters that you think you might like and then slaughter them before you even get a chance to know them, which is visceral and upsetting and usually surprising, but not really all that powerful in the long term. It's not a death of someone you care about, it's a death of the potential to care about them. Not only does it feel somewhat cheap that the show's first major death in a while is someone that they just introduced, it also sucks because I don't really feel like I'm going to miss him. He proved quickly enough that he was a kind, upstanding, lawful good fellow with the charm of a charismatic leader, but we never really got to know him. Qrow did, though, and I think some of the sadness and rage that comes with this moment is based in sympathizing with him. Clover was very clearly a potential avenue for Qrow to be happy again. He's more upbeat and warm than we've ever seen him in this volume, and to have that suddenly taken away right when it was taking shape does not bode well for his future, especially since this isn't the first time that death and loss have torn Qrow to pieces. But without the audience getting to know Clover alongside him, understanding his wants, his needs, seeing him grapple with his flaws, watching him develop, we can't empathize with Qrow, at least not entirely. We can only sympathize. Of course, this isn't to say that you were somehow wrong if you liked Clover and were sad about his death. I just personally think we're missing a few major chunks of what would have made him a more full, complete character and thus a more painful loss. Like a motivation, for example. He mentions a couple times that he trusts Ironwood with his life, but we never find out exactly why that is, and thus what makes him tick is kind of a mystery. Especially since he gives his life for Ironwood's cause, it would have been really nice to know the driving force behind his actions. On the topic of character motivation, Qrow... Look, I'm not normally the type to get up in arms about characters being quote-unquote stupid or making the wrong choices. I think that characters making mistakes or doing something that we, the audience, with our infinite wisdom, wouldn't do can be an important part of making a character feel real, so long as those mistakes aren't blatantly out of character. They do try to sell Qrow's decision to us here, mainly through Clover. The second he finds out that Qrow and the others are wanted, he focuses all of his attention on capturing Qrow and underestimates Tyrion, probably because they already beat him earlier. When Tyrion proposes their little team-up, Qrow doesn't actually immediately trust him and starts to just continue attacking him, but Clover stops him, and when Tyrion helps Qrow out of that jam, Qrow just seems to kind of say, fuck it, yeah, let's team up. I appreciate that there was some justification of Qrow's choice, but not unlike Clover's development and characterization, it just wasn't enough. Even with all of that, it feels out of character for Qrow to trust the word of an insane man who tried to stab his niece's eye out and nearly killed him when he got in the way, especially because that score to settle is very clearly on his mind. And when a character's behavior doesn't align with their motives, the audience disconnects. From the moment Qrow and Tyrion team up, you're no longer with Qrow, you're just watching him do the wrong thing. And that is tense for its own reasons, but the drama of the moment, especially the pain of being manipulated into getting your friend killed, would hit so much harder if the justification for Qrow trusting Tyrion even a minute was strong enough. But that's enough talking about the mishandling of characters. Let's get back to talking positive, shall we?
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
I submit that Ironwood is the greatest fucking villain in RWBY. With the exception of Neo and like maybe Emerald, every villain in this show is a campy, over-the-top conglomerate of villain tropes. And even when they're fun, and some of them are quite fun, they're usually lacking in depth. But Ironwood is a real person. His previous characterization as someone with a good heart and good intentions, but maybe not the best methods, and maybe a little bit too much faith placed in strength and violence, guides us gently into an opening where the characters don't exactly trust him, but have no choice but to rely on him. Without that previous characterization, Ruby's call not to tell him everything would have felt completely out of the blue. But that decision is immediately called into question by who Ironwood appears to be. A man who still believes in the power of marching robotic soldiers and massive airships, but who demonstrates a capacity for trust, rationality, honesty, and even kindness. He made my heart melt twice in episode 2 with how he excitedly gets down on one knee to talk to Oscar, and the utterly awkward sincerity with which he hugs Qrow. He lets RWBY keep the lamp, he grants them Huntress licenses, and though the willingness to sacrifice Mantle's well-being for his project raises some eyebrows, he almost seems to be a trustworthy man. Still a dictator, but at least one they could maybe count on. But that's him when things are calm and well. We've already seen what pushes James to make questionable decisions. Hardship, stress, uncertainty. And when episode 6 delivers that in spades, we immediately see that overly strict, cold dictator return. Blake puts it nicely as his tendency to overreact. It's here that we're granted an even deeper understanding of James during his conversation with Oscar. It lays out the exact emotion behind his bad calls with extreme clarity. That emotion is fear, and they make us feel that fear with one of the most pulse-pounding and immediately effective shots of the whole damn series, which also cleverly reminds us about the symbol of the Black Queen so that it doesn't come flying out of left field later. Ironwood saying "the way she told me she was there" is a really good way of showing us why exactly it was he felt fear. He wasn't just afraid because they were under attack, he was ready for that. He was afraid because in spite of his preparation, he felt helpless. Now, with Tyrion in the city, he's beginning to feel that fear again. And then, just to add fuel to the fire, he's immediately put on trial for the reckless dictatorism that he engages in because of that fear. However, by some miracle, two actually, named RWBY and Oscar, he manages to pull out of that situation with his shit together and a plan for defeating his enemies. He uses some clever deception to arrange the right circumstances, but from there he gets to do what he's good at, use his hard-headed strength to crush his enemies. I love that by the time Ironwood damages his arm, probably permanently to stop Watts, it's barely a surprise, because by now we're very aware of the fact that that's exactly the kind of thing he'd do. But then, out of nowhere, he finds himself in the same position as he was during Volume 3, outmaneuvered by the woman he fears more than anything in the world. And when Salem goes out of her way to intimidate him personally, right at the moment that he is helplessly injured and exhausted, that fear sets in. Then he starts making those poor decisions again. Suddenly, he views all of that work that Oscar and the rest had done trying to appeal to his humanity as giving in to weakness, since it was in the exact moment he put his faith in others that Salem made her move. So, he goes back to doing what he was doing before. to what he believes will work, even if that means doing something awful. Because in his eyes, that's what a hero would do. It's a character arc centered around getting to know James on a deeper level, trying to predict how he'll react, what he'll do. It's tense, it flows, there's a good mix of ups and downs, and it's fascinating. I know there are some people who think Ironwood's turn to the dark side was a bit too drastic, that it's out of character for him to be blasting Oscar off a cliff without hesitation, but all of those people are homophobic. I'm just kidding. Personally, I feel it makes perfect sense for James to go full bad guy here. That lack of emotional consideration or vulnerability, that willingness to sacrifice whatever it takes to destroy whatever gets in his way, that is what Ironwood thinks strength is. He says as much talking to Oscar earlier, admiring Salem's lack of humanity, calling it her greatest advantage. And thus, when his entire country is on the line, when his attempts to be more human have left him vulnerable to infiltration and possible defeat, he makes a final decision to discard his humanity, even as it pains him. So when Oscar, the kid who he'd grown to appreciate and respect even outside of being the new Ozpin, returns and implores him to do the right thing, he reacts with powerful anger. Because this is the person who had the audacity to advise him without telling him the whole truth. This is the person who advocated for letting his guard down, leaving this opening that Salem has exploited. And this is the person who guided him away from the militaristic, strength-based mindset that he is now doubling down on. So of course he says that Oscar and the others can't see the big picture. Of course he'd argue to sacrifice Mantle to defeat Salem. And of course he'd shoot the person getting in his way. That is exactly what an Ironwood whose worst fears have been confirmed and whose worst habits are being embraced would do. There's a very clear tragedy to it. From the moment we're introduced to Ironwood, we start to get the sense that he has it in him to become a villain in his efforts to do good, but also that Team RWBY and Oscar could be his chance to grow beyond his problematic mindset and become a real hero. This character arc is about which way he ended up swinging, and managed to make his descent into the best antagonist that RWBY has produced, outside of Neo for completely different reasons, into one hell of a compelling tale. On a smaller but related note, Oscar is a character. He isn't just a flesh shoot for Ozpin, and he isn't just a side bitch who grapples with his place in the conflict off-screen. As a result, when Ozpin returns and Oscar uses that green magic shit that Ozpin used against Cinder, it feels earned. Although maybe earned is the wrong word, since although he did do a very good job trying to help Ironwood, and his only real mistake was trusting RWBY when she decided not to tell Ironwood everything, he did kind of fail and needed Ozpin to save them. I kind of wish he'd unlocked Ozpin's memories of the cane on his own. But it is cool that this moment of power for him acted as the end to a subtle little arc about Oscar gaining self-confidence. Enough self-confidence that he tells Ozpin to shut the fuck up with his apologies and tell him how to save Mantle, which is rad as hell. Oscar's journey to this point may not have been handled very well, so he isn't exactly standing on solid groundwork, but I am excited to see how he continues to grow in the future. Alright, so this review is already running quite long. I'm not going to have time to cover everything in intense detail, so let's start to wrap this up with a question. What was this volume about? Well, I think it's fairly obvious. If you binged Volume 7 in an evening and took a shot every time someone says the word trust, you'd die. The opening theme is called Trust Love, and given that that is essentially the stance that both Nora and Oscar take, trying to convince their respective husbands to chill out a bit, and also given that the last episode is called The Enemy of Trust and features a lengthy monologue about fear and an end credit song called Fear, it's pretty clear what this volume is trying to say. That's not a bad thing. The ideas that you're trying to get at don't necessarily need to be hidden by layers of vagueness or uncertainty. I wouldn't call it annoyingly unsubtle. The one complaint I have regarding theming is the question of consequences. The show comes down hard on Ironwood for giving in to fear and ignoring emotions, painting it as a transformation into a true antagonist. And it certainly looks down upon Ren's choices, although with much more sympathy. But they aren't the only ones who made mistakes. In fact, I think one of the most key mistakes in this volume is RWBY's choice not to trust Ironwood with the whole truth. In the moment, being careful seems like the right call, and her team supports her because they all love her and think she can do no wrong. And why wouldn't they think that? She never does do wrong. But by lying to someone who trusts her, she's being very obviously hypocritical, and I knew that this choice was going to have Consequences. For the first time in a while, it seemed like Ruby Rose was making a mistake that would matter. You know, like a human would. Even though I was rooting for Robin and Ironwood to end up on the same team, I had a similar reaction to Blake and Yang going rogue. But even as the consequences of those mistakes rear their ugly heads, they don't feel quite as consequential as they could have. The show hardly comes down on Ruby for the part she played in Ironwood's turn and in them going rogue against the most powerful nation in Remnant. There's no moment at the end where she stops and realizes that she fucked up. I will clarify that I'm not trying to shame Ruby for her failures or something like that, especially because she is not real. I just think that characters making mistakes and feeling the consequences makes for better drama, but the ending doesn't really come across that way. In fact, despite everything that just transpired, this ending seems somewhat happy if you just focus on Team Ruby and Penny. Team Juniper are the only ones with the right idea. They're struggling with the fact that this is not a favorable outcome, that they failed and ended up right back where they started, but worse. Ren is not in a healthy state of mind right now, but him acknowledging that they failed feels a lot more dramatic and powerful than Team Ruby beating the shit out of the Aesops and leaving with a smile and a cheerful heart the second things aren't going their way. If the thematic idea that the volume is ending on is that they failed at the whole trust-love thing because of suspicion and fear, it should have pushed the consequences of that failure on our protagonist a little bit harder, making for a far more powerful and weighty ending. Now, I just spent 2 massive fucking videos criticizing the ever-living shit out of this volume of RWBY. But something that I don't want to be lost in the midst of all that criticism is that this is easily the best RWBY has been since the second half of Volume 3. Easily. This feels like a return to form in so many ways. The music has variety. It isn't all starting to blend together like it was. And I'm not a music critic, so this opinion means nothing, but by the ancient ones do I love some of the tracks that Jeff and Casey put out this volume. The story still bit off a little more than it could chew in terms of how much it could do at once, but even so, it felt like a strong, self-contained narrative in and of itself, and not something that only kind of works as part of a larger whole. There were actual stakes, which I'd forgotten was a big reason I'd fallen in love with this show in the first place. The show looks amazing beyond anything they've done before, and I love the absolute shit out of Penny's new design, and Blake's haircut, and Jean's haircut, and Ironwood's beard, and Winter with her hair down, and Fiona Time, and many other things. Some of the Aesops have weapons that feel like classic RWBY weapons. Nice! More of that, please. And on the topic of weapons, the fight scenes in this volume absolutely blew me away. They've been able to impress me without Monty in the past, but only in brief spurts, like once or twice per volume. So when they just kept doing it over and over again, and not stopping once they started, I lost it. Like, holy shit, this 3-way fight is still going, and it's still awesome. I hope to discuss the fight scenes in more detail in the future, but for now, I'll say that while it isn't all perfect, if this volume was the standard for fight scenes going forward, I would be anything but disappointed. So yeah, compared to the rest of the show, Volume 7 is fucking good. This is truly RWBY at its best. But I have one last question. Is that a depressing thought? If this is the best RWBY can do, or at least the best it's done in a while, and it's still so very, very flawed, what does that mean for the future? Is it ever really going to be able to compete with other much better shows, or has the damage already been done? It's up to you to decide, but for me, I like to think of it as a step in the right direction. A big step, a very important step, because if this series really wants to become the incredible piece of media that I know it can be, it still has an awfully long way to go. And for the first time in a long while, I am truly, genuinely excited to follow it on that journey.
Captain!
Yeah, yeah?
No! No! Dude, we have so much shit to go! Holy fucking shit!